Welcome to this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, your host. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to hit the like button. Also, comment, share, and subscribe. To enjoy sneak previews of our videos, exclusive content, and more special programming in the works, join our Patreon page, patreon.com/thought-to-action. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to our Ask Us Anything sessions, where we at the London Center answer your questions. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our website, londoncenter.org. Much of the recent U.S. headlines are dominated by the COVID Omicron variant, some, not all of the important trials going on, and dealings with China. Flying under the radar in many ways, and not less deserving of our attention, though, is what's happening with Russia and former Soviet territories, now independent nations, Ukraine and Belarus. We'll be going over these issues with our panel: London Center for Policy Research President Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Shaffer, London Center Distinguished Fellow Navy Captain retired Pete O'Brien, and special guest former DIA agent and author of Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America, Rebekah Koffler. First, let's look at the situation with the Russia-Ukraine border. At this time, at the time we're taping, Russia has sent 94,000 troops there, while at the former Crimea-Ukraine border, flexing its muscles, according to the Associated Press. So what advantage would it be for Russia to keep intimidating Ukraine at the risk of potential war?
I guess I can start on that, Chris. Thanks for kicking this off for us, and thanks for Rebecca and Pete being here. So I think one of the things that Putin has made clear from a long time ago, more than a decade, is that it is his desire to reestablish the prestige of the old Soviet Union. And I think he's very patient. He's very much attuned to using, I would say, precise aggression for purposes of reestablishing what he believes the current, today, Russia has the right to dominate. And the Russians have always said, and this is their philosophy, that is very clear: what's ours is ours, and what's yours is negotiable. And I think that's what he's doing here. So it's nothing new, but I think what he sees in the abject failure of the Biden foreign policy, everything from Afghanistan to the dust up between the Australians and British and France over nuclear submarines, the complete feckless response to all China aggression, I think Putin sees an opportunity. And so he's deliberately moving military forces into place. He's purposely used Russia's commercial and energy dominance to gain market in Europe during winter, Gazprom and other points of access. So I think Putin is very much understanding and very much understands the use of the full scope of Russia influence, political, military, commercial, and is using that to drive his objectives to establish a new, very dominant Russia that is able to essentially use Europe as an area of influence and use Ukraine as a fully owned subsidiary of Russia. That's what I'm seeing. And I'm going on the record, as others are too, forecasting that if we don't do anything to seriously show, we, the U.S., show any serious sign that we're going to oppose his aggression, I think it's a good chance Putin's going to move aggressively using military force sometime in January, February of the coming year. So that's my assessment.
I completely agree with Tony. 100%. Putin sees a window of opportunity, definitely during President Biden's first term, to achieve what he sees his strategic ambition and Russia's national interest, and that is to rebuild in some shape or form the former Soviet Union. In fact, the Russians have already set up what's called the Eurasian Economic Union, but the word economic really is just a sort of a pretext for a military alliance. Putin wants to rebuild what he calls the strategic buffer zone, right? and the security perimeter that Russia for centuries has relied on to fight off foreign invaders, right, so to speak. So Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and all the former Soviet states have served as sort of the deterrent that Putin and the previous presidents and the czars used this type of doctrine, trading blood for territory, enemy's blood for territory, right? So he's using that narrative and that mindset in order to rebuild, as Tony said, that area. What is alarming today is that he actually has the capability to put his money where his mouth is, and that is why he has demonstrated 2 tests this past month. One is the anti-satellite missile test, and the second one is the hypersonic weapon test. He's telegraphing to NATO and to the United States that Russia has the stomach to actually fight the shooting war. This is what President Biden said, quote unquote, shooting war. And that is the sort of the actual crux of the matter, why we're talking about it, because the conflict is escalating into the realm that neither country actually wants to go, the kinetic realm, but Russia believes the war in the kinetic realm is inevitable.
I think it's important to put a little bit more recent history on this. The Russian interest in buffer zones is insatiable. Ideally, it would run from their buffer zone and run from Portugal to Singapore, but the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 resulted in Belarus and Ukraine separating out from Russia, taking that buffer zone away from them. That buffer zone in recent history, in recent memorable history, was what ate up a large slice of the German assault against Mother Russia. So they do remember it. And of course, in 1994, in 1991, when Ukraine split off, Ukraine had 1,700 nuclear weapons in the form of 33 bombers and I want to say about 160 ICBMs, SS-19s and SS-24s. They were the 3rd largest nuclear power in the world. The United States and the United Kingdom, but primarily the United States, guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty if Ukraine would surrender the nuclear force. So Ukraine did. And of course, in 2014, after the Sochi Olympics, the 22nd Combined Arms Army moved into Crimea, seized Crimea, and the United States, United Kingdom, the West, Europe, etc., whatever you want to title it, did nothing to Russia. And at that point, Putin knew that it was now a matter of timing, opportunity before he would move on Ukraine. It was not if, it was simply a matter of when. And his planning took a sidestep starting in January 2017. He waited 4 years, and now the 4 years are up, and he's getting ready to move again. And he wants his buffer zone back. It's very simple. And so we now arrive at this situation. He has moved forces into the region, additional forces. There are normally 2 combined arms armies, the 8th and the 20th, I believe, that are within striking distance of the Ukraine. The 41st has been moved in from Siberia, from Western Siberia, 1,500 miles away. And of course, there's the 22nd, which is still in place, which is a core mine, essentially, in Crimea. So that they have adequate forces. Ukraine is not, as the Germans demonstrated quite adequately, not defensible. There is one major geographic feature that splits up Ukraine, the Dnieper River, and the tactician par excellence, Field Marshal Manstein of the German army, commented that the Dnieper was not a barrier. It was too fordable in too many places, and it did not act as a barrier of any note to the German army as well. So the ability to actually move into Ukraine from Russia is very real, and the Russians very much have the capability.
Secretary Antony Blinken has issued warnings to Russia of serious consequences over this situation. Still, after what we've seen from the Biden administration and his foreign policy overall, how do you think Putin is taking Blinken's threats? As a serious line in the sand? Or is he just hearing the Secretary of State saying, peep?
I'm sure Putin has crawled up under the table in the Kremlin. You know, unfortunately, the sad truth is that our chief executive has demonstrated that he simply does not have the cojones to stand up to Putin. You know, during the summit that President Biden actually offered to Putin, despite the fact that Russia has been waging crippling cyber attacks in the United States, President Biden demonstrated that he's absolutely no match to the Russian authoritarian. Not only we haven't done anything to Russia in response to those cyber attacks, President Biden gave him a roster of 16 critical infrastructure sectors, which is effectively a target list for Russia to attack. So no, I believe that Putin is absolutely dismissing what Blinken or anyone else in the current administration is saying. That's just my opinion, my assessment, not just an opinion, professional assessment.
I want to be fair. It's difficult when I've recognized Blinken's actions and activities have been one of a man who is either completely compromised relating to principles and capability, or someone who is working for the other side. There's nothing in between, because Blinken has not used the full weight of the prestige and access to our allies as a method of actually telling Putin that any real military aggression would be answered with real military response. And NATO, in this case, as Rebekah said, Putin's been doing things all the time now to say, I'm serious. I'm going to take military action. And we've done virtually nothing. One of the things that Pete and I were speaking about earlier today, when we were discussing this in preparation for this taping, is the fact that many of us participated in something called Reforger, Return of Forces to Germany, but back during the 80s. This was a demonstration, I think it was every 5 years, that we would do to show that we not only had the political will, but the military capacity to return a significant number of military forces to Germany for purposes of defending Germany and Europe against the Warsaw Pact, the old Soviet Union. Now that Poland is a strong ally, one of the things that we have done, and we did do under President Trump, is deploy forces, big old brigades of armor to Poland to prove that point. The fact that we have not done this, that we have not actually flexed our military will in a way that's observable and credible, tells me that Blinken is not serious, and anything he does at this point will simply be a paper tiger, and Putin will see that. Pete?
Yes, I mean, I two thoughts. On a strictly tactical level, if you were going to defend Ukraine, the nation of Ukraine, as I said, has essentially no defensible borders. So if you're going to defend it, you would need to set up a defense in depth, and you would need to move in a lot of anti-armor capability and anti-air capability, because the Russians would attempt to establish air control over the country of Ukraine. And there simply has not been. I mean, we have in fact under President Trump, there was some weaponry sold to the Ukrainian army, but nothing to the extent that would need to be done to make it defensible. The other piece to this is, if you really want to make this serious, is you make sure that Europe is independent from an energy perspective, independent of Russia. And in fact, we were sort of moving down that road in 2019 and 2020 with the expansion of the U.S. Oil and gas industry and the sale of LNG and petroleum products to Europe was growing. And then that was killed, and the go-ahead was given to the expansion of the Russian pipelines into Europe, essentially making Europe more dependent on Russian energy sources rather than less, making it that much more difficult to consider challenging Russia and any of its moves into the country of Ukraine. So if you want to look at this either from an operational and tactical perspective, the military, or from a strategic perspective, the energy problem, in both cases, we have, at best, dragged our feet in the tactical situation. In the strategic situation, we have stepped backwards if you were wishing to prevent Russian actions in Ukraine.
And I just wanted to follow up on what Pete is saying. Basically, the fact that we're in this situation right now is shame on the intelligence community and on our national security apparatus, because by the time that you have to defend, something that has already taken place, you have already lost. What happened to, us following what Sun Tzu was saying, know your enemy, know yourself, right? What happened to the proverbial indications and warnings, the I and W, that we no longer do, apparently? There were all kinds of signs and signposts that Putin was getting ready to do this sort of thing. In fact, as early as 2010, Russia has declared that it views the United States and NATO as their top threat, just like what the Soviet Union did. Nothing has really changed. And yet, we didn't put the serious resources on this key target. In fact, Gina Haspel herself, the former CIA director, admitted a couple of years ago that CIA only at that point started to reprioritize Russia as a top threat. It's unacceptable. We have to be able to follow multiple threats at the same time. Instead, we put all our eggs in the proverbial, GWAT basket, the global war on terror. Took our eyes off the targets, serious targets such as Russia and China, and now we're scrambling. Now we're putting our warfighting force in an untenable situation where we potentially would want them to do things when they don't have the competitive advantage, and it's just unfair to the military men and women who are already stretched, to the max, to put them in that situation. We have to give them everything that we need and very, very much, earlier in the kill chain, so to speak, than we do right now.
So I guess that's 3 votes for Peep. Having said that, Pete, you started on this, so let's start with you here. What are Ukraine's chances of being able to fight Russia off, and how much NATO support will be needed and expected?
Well, Ukraine is not without some resources, and they have about 250,000 men under arms, a little more than that, I think. And they do have some anti-armor capability, but they just don't have the mobility or the air power to match Russia. They do have a potent air force, but it is nowhere near the size or capability of Russia's. And that without the necessary air assets in order to prevent Russia from establishing air control, it could be a very quick engagement. And particularly, I would think that the Russians would want to move on eastern Ukraine, particularly the Donbass region, excuse me, which is the region, if you're looking at the map of Ukraine, it's the region in the lower right-hand corner. But beyond that, obviously the Russians would want, inevitably, whether they take it all at once or take it in several bites, the coastline. They would want the Nikolaev yards, the port of Odessa. These are spectacular facilities. It's a beautiful city, and with beautiful shipyards. And of course, in the end, they want the breadbasket. They want that huge piece of land. What is 100,000 square miles of beautiful farmland that is sort of the heart of Ukraine, in which can feed damn near all of Europe. But the ability to defend against it, the land is flat. We're talking mainly steppe, high grasslands, and some forests. The forests are mostly gone. The Russians, if the Russians were to actually do this, I would expect to see their tank army. I think it's the 51st or 50th Tank Army, which is headquartered in Moscow, a couple hundred miles away. They could very easily move. The roads are good. They could very easily move in a matter of a couple of days, get a large chunk of that element moved into the region. They would hit the Ukrainians with an awful lot of firepower. It would be very unlikely that the Ukrainians could offer more than a short, violent resistance, and then it would quickly degenerate into small fights. The Russians just have the preponderance of force.
This is exactly what Putin wants. Just like Pete mentioned, the engagement would be very quick. Putin wants a surprise and he wants a quick engagement because he understands that if he gave time, so to speak, to NATO to mount additional forces, then he would lose. Russia still fears the United States and NATO kinetic capability because he believes we're superior at it. And this is why he has been varying the force posture. This is not the first time that he has orchestrated a military buildup along the Ukrainian border, including having weaponry tanks, intelligence operatives, both GRU and SVR. We had the very same situation a few months ago. And this is because he wants to desensitize the U.S. and Western intelligence services to these various changes, dial up, dial down, so that he could mount a surprise attack at the time of his choosing and when he believes that the window of opportunity presents. And this is why we need to be extremely vigilant. Our intelligence services need to be on top of this situation and follow the situation very closely. Unfortunately, as Pete said, Ukraine only has so much, and the preponderance of force is on Russia, as it really has always been. Russia is still the top dog in the region, in Eurasia, even though it feels that it's inferior to purely kinetic force of the United States and NATO.
As Pete pointed out earlier, we're obligated to support Ukraine based on their giving up a significant number of nuclear weapons. That exchange of weapons for safety is something that as I recall, the Clinton administration, a Democrat administration, signed up to. So I know Biden is always big on talking about prestige and not stabbing our allies in the back. But the reality is here, I just don't think he's going to stand up here. I mean, he's given no indication other than flubbing the potential of stating clearly that Taiwan is of strategic interest to the United States, and we're not going to back down. Blinken backed down on that. Now we are faced with a situation where there's a credible deployment of military forces all around the borders of Ukraine. That's not disputed. There's no dispute about everything else that we talked about today regarding the being factually positive. It's out there. Anybody can verify it. What's lacking here is a clarity of what will we do should Putin do what he's planning to do. And I think to Rebekah's point, it'll be very quick. It'll be lightning. talk about blitzkrieg. I think Putin would indeed take the lessons of the old Third Reich and use it for purposes of moving into Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, God bless them, showed a great deal of resistance. I would encourage people to go back and look at the Battle of Stalingrad. Talk about an interesting situation where the Ukrainians really stood up to the Third Reich with the Russians in the lead. So what happens if the Ukrainians then find themselves having to defend themselves against Russia? It sets up a very interesting situation. I unfortunately don't believe the Ukrainians are going to be able to sustain themselves very long without outside support, and it would be very quick. Not to say that there wouldn't be then created some sort of resistance to Putin. I think it's a good possibility that after the fact that the international community may do something. But unfortunately, at this point, should Putin decide to act militarily, there's very little that can be done to stop him from very quickly overwhelming the Ukrainian military and occupying the major centers of population and commerce very quickly.
I think President Biden is going to call Putin a killer and be done with it.
But I think Putin knows that already, Rebecca. I think he's comfortable in that. I think he's comfortable being called a killer. I just don't think he cares.
Oh yeah, I think he even considers it a compliment.
I think so. Yeah, exactly.
He thinks the killer, Putin is probably like, how he likes to walk around bare-chested, and it's totally a compliment for him.
Yep.
Another component of Putin's aggression toward Ukraine is the relatively sudden submission to the Russian leader from Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko. Now, here's a guy who has not only recently publicly recognized Crimea as part of Russia after claiming neutrality since the initial 2014 annexation, but he recently offered to host Russian nuclear weapons and is currently working on pushing Middle Eastern refugees from their side, the east, into Poland and the west. Let's also point out that Lukashenko's recent election victory has been considered questionable, and Moscow money went into weathering the protests. How does this all fit into not only the Russia-Ukraine situation, but speculation of a power-hungry Putin plan to reestablish something similar to a Soviet Union under him?
Well, that's absolutely part of Putin's plan. Belarus is already part of the Eurasian Economic Union, or as Putin already refers to it, the Union. So he is just basically letting Lukashenko know and that Belarus is part of what deservedly, quote unquote, belongs to the Russian Empire. And Lukashenko is signaling that he's on board with it. But it's very interesting that he has just agreed to host the nuclear weapons. So it's an interesting signal. But I think Pete has an excellent thought, on that. So I'll just let him talk about that, because I totally agree with what Pete believes in that situation.
I'll just a couple of quick points here. We'll close with leading to the nuclear weapon issue. The first off is again, I believe there is a pipeline that runs into Europe that runs through Belarus. Again, this issue of independence, energy independence, and the strategic implications for Europe in our response to Putin. The second thing, of course, is that if there are nuclear weapons in Belarus, that would seem to be a justification for the Russians to put more ground forces in there as well, which would provide a jump-off point to make a big left hook or right hook, rather, into northern and western Ukraine. But the third thing is the implication, sort of the second and third order effects of nuclear weapons being placed in Belarus 25 years, 30 years, 25 years after nuclear weapons had been removed from Ukraine. I think the thing that we have to think about that is that other people are going to look at that and reflect on the importance of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are a thing that changes the game. As a friend of mine says, nothing says independence like your own nuclear weapons. And if you were North Korea, you've already learned that lesson. If you're Iran, you really want to embrace that concept. And I think that if you were the Republic of Korea, Japan, or Taiwan, you would look at that and say to yourself, particularly after the United States made a promise to put Ukraine under the U.S. nuclear umbrella and then abrogated that promise in 2014, I think if you were the Republic of Korea, Japan, or Taiwan, who have ostensibly lived under the U.S. nuclear umbrella since the 50s, I think you would look at all this and say to yourself, maybe we need to rethink this whole idea of who has and who does not have nuclear weapons. It raises some interesting thoughts.
Yeah, to carry on and I think cap off our discussion today, the nuclear weapons issue is something that all modern powers understand that it's not about their use. It's not remotely about the use. It's about just having it. Having it is that thing that will ensure your protection. And a guy named Muammar Gaddafi learned the hard way that the moment you give up all of your ability to research or retain a nuclear weapon, you're not going to be very much respected. So I think a lot of folks watched what Gaddafi did to cooperate. And I know for a fact, based on people I knew who were involved in negotiations, who met with and dealt with Gaddafi directly, that Gaddafi had the best intentions after 9/11 of cooperating. As a matter of fact, what's grandly ironic is that we actually used his country as a black site location to do enhanced interrogation that nobody wants to talk about now, and that's okay. But the point being is that Gaddafi did cooperate and gave up all interest and all capacity to have nuclear weapons. And I think that's been a driving factor of consideration for all of these countries who will not simply just give up a nuclear weapon or a nuclear weapons program if they think that gives them leverage over the international community. And in this case, I think that going back to the point of prestige that Biden always wants to talk about, this is going to be a huge black eye to the Democrats and to Biden by the fact that should Ukraine fall, and should that failure, that fall, be related back to the fact that people could argue reasonably that giving up nuclear weapons in the 90s resulted in their failure today, I think it's going to cause some real problems. And so the left is always working to, they're heavily funded to do counterproliferation, but they seem to be the worst. They seem to be the worst at doing it because all of their policies result in justification, if you will, for countries maintaining nuclear weapons. It's quite insane. And this is what we're about to see. This failure of U.S. policy relating to Ukraine can directly be traced back to the Democrats' inability to understand how to establish effective policy to protect our allies, to remove nuclear weapons, and say we really mean what we say. So if should Putin invade, it's not only going to be a failure of the international community, it's going to be a fundamental failure of a progressive-driven national security policy, which I think has been on full display in the current administration, and it's going to be traced back to the Clinton administration to how badly some of these policies are. And I don't want to be partisan here, but I think it's very clear that when you think along partisan lines to drive your national security policy, the failure that is Ukraine and our inability to protect Ukraine at this critical time is traced back to a partisan point of view from the left, not of a pragmatic one, which we always drive in our thinking within the London Center. So that's all I'll say about that.
I'd like to add an excellent point on Gaddafi. Tony said that everybody was watching what was happening to Gaddafi, and that includes Putin. That made a very, very strong impression on Putin, who is very scared of the so-called regime change, that he thinks that somehow NATO and the United States are plotting to orchestrate, to get rid of him. So nuclear weapons is something that Putin has been modernizing for more than a decade at this point. And not only he's been modernizing the nuclear weapons and increasing the stockpile that Russia has, which rivals only that of the United States. And in terms of non-strategic nuclear weapons, it even outnumbers us. So Putin also has been modernizing the nuclear doctrine, and has on his orders, Russian General Staff has developed something very unique that is called escalate to de-escalate. And that envisions the use of tactical nuclear weapons to de-escalate a conflict. You know, counterintuitively for Western analysts, Putin believes that if he pops a tactical nuke, that the US and NATO would back off. And this is precisely why former President Trump authorized the development of our low-yield nuclear capability so that we can counter this strategy. And to Tony's point, the leftists always, scream and talk about the disarmament, but the objective is to demonstrate to your adversary that you have the stomach to do the fight, in order to deter him, because you cannot demonstrate deterrence without signaling to the adversary that you're prepared to use the capability that is going to negate his capability. And that can only be done by developing it and demonstrating the will.
And if I can add in here, that its key element of this is to demonstrate a full spectrum of nuclear capabilities. Only if you do that can you essentially keep a situation from escalating. I would go back though to one other issue, the issue of when would Putin do this, and I would throw something out. The issue that people need to remember here is we are facing a harsh winter. We're looking at a colder winter than normal in Europe, which means their energy demands are actually increasing just as they shut down power plants. That means that they're going to need more natural gas imported from, if you will, the east, from Russia and Belarus. And as the depth of the winter hits, January and February, is going to be a very interesting situation to watch geopolitically. Is that when Putin will start, if you will, tightening the screws? And there's an interesting additional issue here. As Putin is tightening the screws, just as he went into Sochi after the went into Crimea after the Sochi Olympics in 2014. We have the Olympics coming up in Beijing in 2022. Next end of February is the extravaganza that is the modern Olympics. Is that another opportunity for Putin to do a sort of a global head fake and move on Ukraine just as the depth of winter settles in? And would that also provide Beijing the opportunity to, if you will, flex their muscle against Taiwan? Lots of interesting pieces on this chessboard, just as the United States has backed off on energy independence and sort of cast its lot as a energy-dependent nation.
We're going to be discussing this and more in future episodes. And yes, we will be delving into that energy question because we do have those issues. We're going to be continuing our series, Thought to Action, here on YouTube and, of course, your wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Chris Cordani. Thank you for being with us and our panel for this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. Please remember to hit that like button. Feel free to comment on our discussion. We appreciate your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel and pound that big red bell for updates on future shows. Find out more about the London Center on our website, londoncenter.org. If you'd like to help us continue to create discussions like this and programming, please join us on Patreon, patreon.com/thought-to-action. You can enjoy sneak previews, special exclusive content, and our Ask Us Anything sessions. Also, you can help us greatly by sharing this video with your friends, your colleagues, and social networks. For our panel at the Herb London Center for Policy Research, I'm Chris Cordani. Thank you, stay informed, and make your day a great one.